What is the gospel? I mean, Paul talks about it. He doesn't necessarily clearly define it in here. We preach about it, we talk about it, we read about it, we encourage each other, right? I think sometimes we as Christians kind of assume everybody knows what the gospel is, and we don't really necessarily know what the gospel is. When Paul talks about the gospel, when he says the gospel is the treasure, the gospel is our hope, the gospel is our life, what is Paul talking about? Okay, good question, I hope. We don't get a clear definition, though we get one verse that expands a little bit. I'll show it to you in a minute. But we do know what Paul preached when he was in Thessalonica. See, one of the problems is this is a case where Paul had been there 2 years earlier, year and a half earlier. They knew what he was talking about, right? They themselves had heard that gospel from him. So when they read this, they knew what he was talking about. What about us? What is it that he's talking about? Well, if we go back to Luke's account of that, this is what we read. He says, as was his custom, and this is in Thessalonica, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, so he's with the Jewish people here, on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah, okay, so this is what he preached. For 3 weeks, the Messiah, again, this is a Jewish group, the Messiah was the anointed one, the Christ, the new David, the new king of Israel, the one who would save Israel. So he said the Messiah, first of all, had to suffer. Second, had to rise from the dead. And then third point of his sermon, and it was apparently the same all the time, this Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah. Jesus suffered and died. Jesus rose from the dead. That's the gospel in its shortest form. That was the basic of it. It's Jesus. Jesus died. Jesus risen again. Jesus paying for our sins. Jesus bringing us new life. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul does take some time to identify the gospel. He says this, now brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, okay? What did I preach? For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Number 1, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Paul didn't use points. He did not have PowerPoint like this. So I do. He didn't. So they're not really in the text. But that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. That he was buried. That he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And then he says some others. Once again, we have 2 things really, right? He died and was buried. He was raised and he was seen. That's the gospel, Paul says. That's what I preach to you. That is your hope. That is our life. Jesus Christ died for our sins, raised again for our new life. The place where we get it in 1 Thessalonians 1 is at the end of 1 Thessalonians at the end of chapter 1. Paul is talking about how they were converted and how they turned to God to serve the living and true God away from idols. He says this, he said, you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and then this. And he does it in kind of reverse order, okay? All right, so you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven. Okay, we got actually 2 new things here, right? If he's in heaven, he ascended, and to wait means he's going to return. So you're waiting for Jesus to return from heaven. He ascended, he returned. He is the one who was raised from the dead. Jesus who rescues us from the coming wrath. Friends, that's what the gospel is. If I put it together, I'm going to do that. And again, I want you to be able to, if somebody says, what do you believe? I want you to be able to say, this is the core of it. This is, and I want to make sure that this is what we bring to the world, because this is all we ultimately have. What is the gospel? 6 things. The good news, all right? It is good news. It is a proclamation. It is an announcement of what somebody has done, of what Jesus has done, all right? It's good news about Jesus. It is not first of all, the gospel is not first of all that you're a sinner. Now, that's why we need the gospel. We might tell people that, but the gospel is not first that it's not about you. It's first about Jesus, all right? He lived a perfect life, born of the Virgin Mary. He was crucified for our sins, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, bringing us forgiveness. He rose again from the dead, conquering death. 4, he ascended into heaven. He is now the true king. He is sitting at the right hand of God the Father. 5, he will come back to judge all things, to make all things new, a coming kingdom. That's it, friends. That's what we preach. That's what our hope is. All right? Jesus lived. He died on the cross. He rose again. He ascended into heaven, and he's going to come back and make everything new. Friends, that's the hope of the world. That's my only hope. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That is what we share. That is what we preach. And then the sixth thing I would say is this: out of his love and grace, he invites us to join him in his new kingdom today. That this is available to us, not by working really hard, not by earning it. It's simply by his grace that he invites us to join him in his death and his resurrection. And he invites us to live a life like him. Friends, that's the gospel, and we need to keep that central. A lot of things flow out of this, right? Evangelism flows out of this. We need to share this good news. Jesus lived, died, rose again, ascended into heaven. He's returning, and he invites you to be a part of his kingdom. That's the God. We need to, evangelism flows out of that. Holiness in our lives, discipleship flows out of the gospel. Trying to live out the kingdom, racial reconciliation flows out of the gospel. But again, we have to keep the gospel central. We have to make sure we keep coming back to what we believe in, is that Jesus died and rose again. That Jesus gave his life for me, and I am loved and accepted and forgiven. That is the hope of the world. That is it. Jesus died and rose again. That's what Paul wants to build into them, okay? So I hope that's a little bit helpful to think about what is the gospel. It's those things. Jesus lived, died, rose again, ascended, is coming back, and invites us to be a part of his kingdom.